We're going to get started in a few moments, but an announcement that one of our morning plenary addresses will be in Spanish. So if you need translation, now would be a good time to get translation materials for Spanish. Good morning. We're going to get started. Good morning. I'm going to make just an announcement about the posters and the website while people continue to get translation devices if you need for the Spanish plenary this morning. But we're going to get underway. Okay. In addition to the physical posters upstairs in the gymnasium that many of you have been enjoying beyond the poster session itself, I just wanted to remind people that we have a web gallery that will live beyond the conference. So you don't have to rely on your little camera photo images of any of the posters. As the poster presenters know, the web gallery is available on our website. You can find it under Conferences Sarajevo. And if you created a poster for this event and you didn't get it off to us, there's no time limit. Just send it, as I've indicated, to Jack McErlin, and he can upload your JPEG or your PDF of the poster. This might be a good reminder to update your own entry on the map. The map, as you know, is where we plot our names and locations and research interests to make it easier to connect after conferences like these. Perhaps at the coffee break you could ask Dan Fleming, who's waving his hand, about how he used the map to connect from Australia with a colleague in Brazil. I now give you my good friend, Professor William O'Neill, to chair the first panel.
My dear friends, welcome to our 5th plenary today. We invite our sisters to sit together. Dorothy Day, the founder of the Catholic worker community, was fond of quoting Dostoevsky, that love in practice is a harsh and dreadful thing compared to love in dreams. Today, we will explore the implications of such love, dialogical theology and reconciliation in harsh and dreadful times. A doctor of social sciences and specialization in communications. She has a master's degree in the social doctrine of the Church as well, is an analyst in social communications and a professor of research at the Universidad de la Amazonia, Colombia. Our second speaker will be Elias Upango, who is a Jesuit from Kenya and director of the Hekima Institute for Peace Studies and International Relations at Hekima University College. He holds his PhD in Peace Studies from the University of Bradford in the United Kingdom. And we want you to know that his recent book, published just this year, Pope Francis and Good Governance in Africa, is available for purchase here. Our final speaker is Alain Tamasset, who is a French Jesuit and professor of moral theology, dean of the Faculty of Theology at Centre Servis, the Jesuit faculty in Paris, chairman of the Association of Theologians for Moral Research, ATEM, Ecumenical and Francophone International Association of Theological Ethicists, and the chief redactor of the journal Revue d'éthique de la théologie morale. We will proceed as we have done in the past. Each speaker will speak for 15 minutes, and then we will have time for questions at the end. Thank you, and welcome to our first speaker.
Good morning. I speak Spanish. ¿Es posible la paz en América Latina y el Caribe sin distribución de tierras? La presentación que hacemos en realidad habla justamente de la tenencia y distribución de tierras en América Latina y Caribe. Es una realidad que se manifiesta desde hace siglos. Haré una metáfora fotográfica para comprender la realidad en el tiempo. Pensemos las tierras en manos de las comunidades originarias del continente y posteriormente la gran mayoría de esas tierras serán fraccionadas y cedidas por la Corona de España a nuevos destinatarios. Como para poder ambientarnos. Esto ya nos permite en pocas líneas trazar una imagen sobre la temática y el conflicto que representan. El tema lo analizaremos de la siguiente manera. En primer lugar, analizar la realidad desde el método profético, reconociendo la conflictividad y las prácticas transformadoras existentes. En segundo lugar, comprender la posibilidad de otros horizontes para justamente la discusión de la tenencia y distribución de las tierras. Y en tercer lugar, el tratamiento de la pregunta inquietante: ¿es posible la paz en estos escenarios y cuál es el camino a transitar? Un análisis de la realidad desde el método profético. Reformas radicales y reformas parciales. Nuestra reflexión se referirá únicamente a los procesos acontecidos hacia finales del siglo XX y comienzos del XXI, conocidos bajo la denominación de reforma agraria, es decir, aquellas políticas que se orientaron a redistribuir tierras excesivamente concentradas en manos de grandes propietarios. Además de esas intervenciones del Estado, el campo latinoamericano fue también escenario de dos grandes revoluciones agrarias, la Revolución Mexicana en 1910 y la Revolución Boliviana en 1952. Dieron origen a programas de reforma agraria significativos. Entonces, las reformas agrarias latinoamericanas del pasado siglo se clasifican, según el experto en el tema brasileño, Arruda Sampaio, en tres subconjuntos: tanto los procesos que se han originado en revoluciones en México y Bolivia, como las reformas agrarias que han provocado alteraciones significativas en los índices de concentración de la propiedad de la tierra que se realizaron en Guatemala, Chile, Perú, Nicaragua y El Salvador. Han representado, ellos sí, una sustancial transferencia de tierras de grandes terratenientes a familias de campesinos. Por otra parte, también puede señalarse un segundo bloque de reformas agrarias constituido por aquellos países que realizaron reformas agrarias superficiales y que agrupa las experiencias de Brasil, Venezuela, Ecuador, Colombia, Honduras, República Dominicana y Paraguay. ¿Qué quiere decir superficiales? La intervención del Estado no alteró significativamente los índices de concentración de la propiedad de la tierra. Basta pensar que en Colombia una sola persona es propietaria de 1 millón de hectáreas. Un dato al margen. Los resultados de estas pseudo-reformas, como las denominó Arruda Sampaio, han sido pobres, enormes burocracias que no lograron siquiera proporcionar soporte técnico y financiación para los asentamientos correspondientes y adecuados. Otros métodos hacia la distribución de tierra son los conflictos violentos, que surcaron también el continente, en Colombia, en México, en Chiapas, en Brasil. En los últimos 10 años hubo 8.082 conflictos violentos por la tierra registrados por la Comisión de Pastoral de la Tierra de la Iglesia Católica Brasileña. Conflictos violentos, aun si de menor escala, también están presentes en Guatemala, Ecuador, Bolivia y Paraguay. Un ejemplo peculiar es Paraguay. Traemos aquí un ejemplo puntual que puede ser interesante. Se trata de Paraguay tiene un simulacro de guerrilla llamado EPP que opera dirigida y financiada por países interesados en el acuífero guaraní. ¿Qué es el acuífero guaraní? El mayor reservorio natural de agua dulce del mundo, donde Paraguay posee el corazón del acuífero y comparte con Argentina, Brasil y Uruguay sus ramificaciones. La Iglesia Católica imagínense el interés por ese acuífero y todo lo que tiene que ver con las tierras. La Iglesia Católica cooperó históricamente a través de pensadores, clérigos y religiosos con aportes centrales al tema de distribución de tierras. Fueron documentos legados a los mismos libertadores. También lo hizo más recientemente con propiedades bajo su custodia, como la reforma agraria de la Iglesia en Chile, llevada adelante por el cardenal Silva Enríquez y avalada en su momento por el Papa Pablo VI. No se puede dejar de considerar también que la Iglesia ha poseído grandes extensiones de tierra que en distintos momentos han sido elementos de crítica y no menos conflictividad. Movidas que no cambiaron la realidad. La situación actual del campesinado latinoamericano presenta algunas similitudes que no deberían aparecer teniendo en cuenta que han pasado por reestructuraciones de la propiedad de la tierra. En efecto, en todos los países mencionados, independientemente del grado de desarrollo y nivel de ingreso per cápita que han alcanzado, el campesinado es el contingente poblacional más pobre, con los peores indicadores de salud e índices más bajos de expectativa de vida. Es también el sector de la población que se encuentra más alejado de la educación. Esto es así, tanto en el sentido de la proporción de familias ubicadas por debajo de la línea de pobreza absoluta, más grande en el campo que en las ciudades, como en la relación al grado de la pobreza en las que ellas se encuentran. Nuevos desafíos en materia de despojo de tierras en América Latina y Caribe. El despojo de las tierras hoy presenta otras características. Las compras de tierras se dan por parte de grandes empresas transnacionales que consolidan su poder estando respaldadas por los gobiernos y por instituciones internacionales como el Banco Mundial, el Fondo Monetario Internacional. Land Matrix, observatorio que monitorea la compra de tierras desde el año 2000, reporta un total en América Latina denominado acaparamiento de tierras para cultivos y alimentos, que abarca 3.927.450 hectáreas. ¿Cuántos países de Europa entrarían en esa cantidad de hectáreas? La mayoría de los conflictos hoy están vinculados a los que tienen que ver con la expansión de la frontera del agronegocio, que sería la explotación de recursos naturales con invasiones, acaparamientos, desalojos y agresiones a campesinos indígenas afrodescendientes. El conflicto se centra en la disputa por producción de alimentos y la producción de commodities. La lucha por la tierra y el riesgo de vida. En Brasil, entre el 85 y el 2016, fueron asesinadas 1.834 personas por conflictos vinculados a la tierra. En Paraguay, según la Comisión de Derechos Humanos, suman 117 miembros de organizaciones asesinados o desaparecidos. En Colombia se han sumado centenares de líderes campesinos, indígenas y afrodescendientes asesinados por la violencia y la defensa de sus territorios en menos de 2 décadas. Larga la lista de mártires en relación al poseso y a la distribución de tierras en América Latina. Una nueva historia se está escribiendo. Un común denominador que hace pensar en nuevos horizontes es la mayor madurez en la concepción del campesinado sobre la dimensión política que implica el tema tenencia y distribución de tierras. Hay conciencia que se trata de una justa y equitativa distribución con un orden político que tiene que ser acorde, la protección de los derechos y un tipo de ciudadanía rural dignificante. Ya no es la lucha por la tierra, no es concebir una lucha por la transformación no solo del modelo agrícola, sino también del propio modelo económico y ecológico integral de los países del continente. De esta realidad de mayor comprensión emergen importantes movimientos y redes que están energizando un nuevo amanecer. En este espacio solo podremos nombrar algunas acciones teórico-prácticas más contundentes del continente. Prácticas transformadoras. Nombraremos solo algunas de las centenares de instituciones y redes de acción que están trabajando en el tema distribución de tierras. Solo en Brasil, el movimiento de los trabajadores rurales sin tierra se extiende proponiendo el modelo por todo Brasil, proponiendo el modelo agrícola campesino para superar el modelo del agronegocio existente. En Ecuador, la Confederación de las Nacionalidades Indígenas presenta una sistemática acción en defensa y protección de los territorios. El movimiento zapatista, con cabecera en Chiapas, México, por años resistente al sistema en forma armada y hoy de accionar pacífico, ha logrado significativos derechos sobre tierra y formas de gobierno de esos territorios. La conocida mundialmente Vía Campesina, que en América Latina toma el nombre de CLOC, Coordinación Latinoamericana de Organizaciones del Campo, que sistematiza constantes informes, trabaja por una reforma agraria integral, con el acompañamiento y la fuerza de una organización internacional y múltiples acciones efectivas. Las significativas recuperaciones de tierras de Fundapaz en Argentina con los mapeos participativos dialógicos, la red de iniciativas de monitoreo de la gobernanza de la tierra y los recursos naturales en Colombia, Bolivia, Honduras y Venezuela, el Movimiento Regional por la Tierra y Territorio y la Fundación Tierra en Bolivia, las comisiones de la Pastoral de la Tierra de los Episcopados Latinoamericanos y del Caribe, que estimulan procesos y han sido significativas en los asentamientos semirurales, el Centro de Estudios Regionales para el Desarrollo de Bolivia, y así podría seguir nombrando significativas redes de trabajo contundente por la distribución de tierras. Salto para poder avanzar. Otros horizontes para la tenencia y distribución de las tierras. Nuevos métodos por una distribución equitativa de la tierra. Hoy podemos comprender que el acceso, la recuperación o la distribución de las tierras puede llegar de la mano de una multiplicidad de métodos y procesos. Sin lugar a dudas, la reforma agraria como respuesta política estructural de un Estado a la realidad equitativa de distribución es sin duda fundamental. Al mismo tiempo se comprende que hoy la situación reinante llama a convocar, a implementar múltiples metodologías de negociación, de resistencia pacífica, de legislación que sea capaz de producir nuevas posibilidades, que integradas a las reformas agrarias puedan dar a los Estados herramientas accesibles, siempre más participativas y siempre más en interlocución con los actores en cuestión. Ante escenarios complejos, intervinculados, no pueden no darse respuestas capaces de interactuar, de ser integrales y múltiples, como lo señala decididamente la encíclica Laudato Si. Las respuestas deben y pueden ser instrumentos en las manos de los estados, de los gobiernos, de las iglesias y de la sociedad civil, de manera de poder concebir el camino y la transformación de políticas aparentemente inamovibles como posibles en flexibilidad, cambio y transformación. Solo 2 ejemplos de acuerdos colectivos, procesos dados en mapeos participativos dialógicos. En Argentina recientemente 462 familias y 72 comunidades indígenas recuperan por el mapeo participativo dialógico 643.000 hectáreas. De la misma manera, la tierra mapuche que se logra negociar con la empresa Bosque Andino. En el ámbito de la red que nos convoca, nos preguntamos seriamente, ¿es posible la paz en estos escenarios? Para quienes concebimos la justicia social como dimensión central de toda posible convivencia, podemos apreciar que no hay reconciliación, por lo tanto, tampoco paz posible, sin reparación histórica de la injusticia social que oprime mayorías y les impide su dignidad. El tema tenencia y distribución de tierras en el continente, como se evidenció, es complejo y prolongado en el tiempo, delincuencial y criminal en muchos casos y arrollador de la dignidad en variados horizontes. Es un tema pendiente en una resolución que siempre se ve incrementado por nuevos factores de impacto, pero que tiene un común denominador, el avasallamiento de la dignidad de las personas y las comunidades. Por medio de la pobreza que ha generado y genera la región más desigual del mundo siendo una de las más ricas de recursos naturales del mundo, el maltrato y abuso del medio ambiente en referencia a una ecología integral, el desconocer las tradiciones sagradas de importantes grupos en el continente. Se trata entonces de encontrar caminos a la resolución de un conflicto secular. Reconciliación no es una palabra de disculpas, no es una palabra que solo nos lleva al reconocimiento de culpas. Es una palabra que requiere sanear las mismas estructuras de pecado y de injusticia. Si en América Latina y el Caribe la enemistad que impide la reconciliación real es resultado de una sistemática y persistente injusticia social estructural que tiene su causa en la concentración de la tierra, entonces hacer esa denuncia es un primer paso a la reconciliación, se vuelve pertinente e indispensable. Hacia una reconciliación activa que se abre a la paz. Vamos hacia la conclusión. Sin duda, un papel fundamental en el camino de la reconciliación que posibilita la paz en el terreno de la inequidad, en la distribución de tierras, no puede faltar la justicia restaurativa. Siguiendo su proceder, reconocimiento del daño causado y las necesidades que genera ese daño, obligaciones de reparar o compensar ese daño, la participación, la reintegración de la víctima e infractor y como expresión de la participación buscar el esfuerzo cooperativo de la comunidad y el Estado. Así es posible generar la sanación de todos los implicados. El infractor debe reparar o compensar el daño. Se trata de promover el compromiso y la participación de las partes afectadas. Víctima, infractor y comunidad, toda actuando en sintonía. La reconciliación como camino a la paz se dará si es junto a un programa para una reconciliación posible, activa, crítica y operante. Debe ser programa verificable como camino y como meta, con un compromiso que hoy reclama y en el cual ya estamos trabajando a nivel latinoamericano y caribeño en diálogo con las grandes redes e instituciones latinoamericanas de la Iglesia. Un escenario articulador, vincular, interactivo y relacional que sistematice y ofrezca a los estados, partidos políticos, iglesias, experiencias religiosas, movimientos sociales y organizaciones todas de la sociedad civil, instrumentos metodológicos capaces de diálogo y resolución de las negociaciones pertinentes. Se trata de trabajar intensamente en la formación de equipos, en ofrecer instrumentos que sean respuestas pacíficas, capaces de una resistencia oportuna, permanente y valiente, de metodologías dialógicas en la resolución de los múltiples conflictos como el tema lo requiere, capaces de interactuar con las reformas agrarias y de transformarlas en reformas agrarias integrales, reto que supone asociar investigación histórica, comunicación en la narración, multiplicación de prácticas efectivas y aprendizajes múltiples de las prácticas, denuncia calificada en los organismos internacionales pertinentes. Alegra poder cerrar esta presentación con una posible respuesta esperanzadora, donde la investigación, la denuncia y la acción se reúnen para entrelazarse y poder ofrecer nuevas perspectivas metodológicas a partir del diálogo. La investigación histórica y actual sobre la realidad, la justicia restaurativa, el reconocimiento de prácticas transformadoras posibles y la articulación comunicativa como respuesta de impacto. Entendemos que el tema es fundamental, encuentra su reconocimiento en el pensamiento y propuesta del Papa Francisco cuando dice que cada persona tiene derecho a estas tres cosas: trabajo, techo y tierra. Muchas gracias.
Years ago, when I was giving a conflict resolution workshop in Zimbabwe, to Jesuit seminarians in philosophy, one of the students from Rwanda asked me if he could tell his story of forgiveness. He narrated how he went back home several months after the Rwanda genocide in 1994, where 800,000 people had been killed. He had gone there to bury his brother and sister who had been killed during the genocide, and he went through a disturbing experience. He happened to be walking along a narrow path in the village and met a man whom everyone indicated had killed the family members. In his own reflection, the young Jesuit said, "When I saw this man coming towards me, I thought he was going to kill me. To my surprise, I could not believe what happened. It appeared to me like a movie. He knelt before me and asked me to forgive him. After some time of confusion and asking myself what was happening and by which force I could not describe then, I took him and embraced him and said, 'I forgive you.' Ever since, I have felt free. I have realized that forgiveness heals even more the forgiver than the forgiven. My wounds have been healed and have been able to heal others. I later found myself desiring to give the gift of my very self to the Lord as a companion of Jesus, whom I am as I write." I choose to begin with this particular story of a young Jesuit whom I had hoped would be here with us in this particular conference, but unfortunately he could not make it, and I asked him for permission to tell his story. Marcel Uineza, who is today a priest and currently doing his PhD in moral theology at Boston College. Dialogical reconciliation is about human encounter drawn from difficult past experiences and in search for a common future with hope for a new life experience. War and conflict blur our pristine human nature, lead us to see evil in other and not the potential goodness and love that God has granted to us. At the heart of reconciliation is dialogue that builds bridges to reach out to the other. Dialogue aimed at reconciliation operates under three main assumptions. First, that relationships have been broken as a result of conflict, which in most cases is characterized by violence, physical and psychological, misunderstanding and disagreements. Second, that trust has been eroded and replaced with suspicion, animosity, and desire to eliminate the other. And third, that social fabric for mutual cohesion has been threatened or damaged. This is the experience of many African societies that have experienced violent conflicts in recent past, such as South Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo, Northern Uganda, Central African Republic, to mention but a few. These conflicts have eroded the social, cultural fabric in many African societies. And in response to these conflicts, there is danger of living in a fantasy of past traditional African society and present that as a living reality. The African continent, in its own wide diversity, ought to creatively review how the current cultural crisis provoked by the invasion of the Western culture, internecine conflicts, and disintegration of cultural leadership have created a vacuum of leadership in finding lasting solutions to existing conflicts. The African Union has put together a panel of the wise, made up of respectable African leaders who have the responsibility of mediating the African conflicts and ensuring peace and sustainability. In the last 10 years, we must say that the number of African conflicts have dropped from 17 to 5. However, there are still many challenges in the continent. There is need to draw together the diverse available spiritual, cultural, and social resources that can creatively be applied to address these conflicts, as well as emerging challenges such as youth unemployment, corruption, poor governance, and inequitable economic systems. Laurenti Magesa, in his recent book, What is Not Sacred, affirms that African society is essentially communal, focused on building intertwined relationships held by cultural values that sustain social cohesion. He asserts that reconciliation ought to be seen as peace and implemented beyond legal approaches, and that emphasis should instead be on sacramental dimensions. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Nontando, Katongole, and others have constantly made reference to this African spirit of Ubuntu, reiterating the fact that our humanity is tied to each other, and that unless broken relationships are healed, the body of Christ continues to be divided. And so dialogical reconciliation in Africa is first and foremost conversational. It is what I may refer to as conversational reconciliation. And in this conversational reconciliation, communal sessions of reconciliation take place in a palaver, a kind of conversation that draws from the wisdom of the elders and members of the community with the intention of reinforcing social accountability and cohesion. The dialogue is not only between two individuals in conflict, but family and clans are represented. This means that the process of reconciliation is not individualized, but communalized to reflect a much larger representation of parties in conflict. Hence, individual identity is subsumed into the family and clan identity. This requires a balance between retributive and restorative justice. And I'll give 3 examples. First, in northern Uganda, following the 22 years of conflict between the Lord's Resistance Army and Uganda Armed Forces, the community was torn apart, given that many young boys and girls were abducted and forced to kill their own family members. The community resorted to applying traditional methods of reconciliation and particularly rituals of healing. Second, in Mozambique, where many years of war had tore families apart and the entire communities, and they resorted to a traditional method referred to as Magamba healing ceremonies, that according to Igreja and Diaz Lambraca, became a theater of reenacting the grudges, bitterness, and discontentment in the hearts of the survivors, without the risk of starting fresh cycles of abuse and violence. These ceremonies also channeled negative feelings and restored the dignity of war survivors. These spaces promoted dialogue between community members, which eventually led to reconciliation. Third is South Africa. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission became a theater of truth-searching, stumble and fumble for reconciliation and healing, as well as an opportunity for rereading past history of human rights abuses with eyes on a future that respects human dignity. South Africa is yet to achieve that particular goal, but a lot has been done. And so these conversational approaches to resolving conflicts imply that dialogical reconciliation demands face-to-face encounter between the parties, common vision for new future, and a commitment to dialogical reconciliation even when we do not achieve a perfect solution. Perhaps the story of Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well is one that captures the bridging experience that we are here discussing at Sarajevo. In this story, we see reconciliation as conversation, a common approach that Jesus constantly applies to educate his listeners. Jesus acknowledges that there is enmity between the Jews and the Samaritans. He knows that it is not right for a Jewish man to speak to an unknown woman, that there is enmity between the Jews and the Samaritan, and that the woman at the well has a troubled life. The immediate point of dialogue is to understand what brings the difference between the two communities. And so Jesus begins a conversation by asking for a drink, for water to drink. But rather than address the immediate need of a thirsty man, the woman picks on the difference between the two. She fails to see the opportunity to bridge the differences between them. You are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman, she says. How can you ask me for a drink? Rather than dwell on the differences between the Jews and Samaritan, Jesus opts to build an intercultural and religious bridge and focuses on the great opportunity for a new life that this encounter presents. If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water, says Jesus to the woman. In the process of conversation, Jesus acknowledges the dispute between the Jews and Samaritans, but he puts much more emphasis on truth and love, founded in the spirit of uniting, as a uniting point where he says to the Samaritan woman, a time is coming and has now come when true worshippers will worship the Father in the spirit and in the truth, for they are the kind of worshippers the Father likes. God is spirit, and his worshippers must worship in spirit and in truth. This indeed is the punchline for any dialogical reconciliation process. Belief in the spirit that moves our hearts to an unexplainable horizon, where we imagine the impossible as possible, and where the construction of new reality is presented to us as full presence of God. For the young Jesuit Marcel, the encounter with the person who had murdered his family members was neither planned nor predictable. To this day, he simply does not know how it happened. And when Rwanda was celebrating 20 years of memorial of genocide, I asked him again to reflect on that particular experience in 2014, about 9 years later. And he told me, I still don't understand how the word I forgive you emerged from my mouth. Yet he knew one thing, that forgiveness as a way of playing confusion, defeat, and hopelessness in us. When one forgives, one gives away a certain part of self, and a deeper feeling of incompleteness lingers on. Marcel felt that he had not been able to fully engage in a conversation of reconciliation with the murderer, despite the words, I forgive you. What followed was therefore what I refer to as a silent internal conversation of forgiveness that ruminates in one's mind and heart. And he says, even though he's still a Jesuit today, when he ran into the church with other people who were running away from the genocide, the priest at the parish chased them away. But he came back to serve the same church. I end with the question, is forgiveness always possible, despite communal pressure in the African societies? To say that forgiveness, and to a great extent reconciliation, is not possible is an easy process, rather, is to ignore the emotional and socio-cultural complexities that often blur the possible positive results of this encounter. In fact, the escape reality of unforgiveness is a comfort zone. For Peter, it was the option of the sword against the Jews who came to arrest Jesus. For James and John, it was a call of fire against the Samaritans who had attempted to prevent Jesus from passing through Samaria. For the elders, it was the stoning to death of the woman caught in adultery. For forgiven debtor, it was the action of imprisoning the person who owed him money. The escape reality of unforgiveness gives a false comfort that revenge and violent action against the offender is a fully justified intervention. Such vengeful actions are carried out to fulfill a sense of emptiness within in search for false realization, self-realization. In the Rwanda genocide, more than 800,000 people killed, 400 years of enslavement of Africans, and also the genocide of 6 million Jews. Persons caught up in unforgiveness circle assume that forgiveness is unattainable, even impossible, due to perceived irreconcilable historical experiences, discordant cultural values, and socio-political competition. This escape reality is comfortable, but only for a while. To conclude, we see that to a great extent, the African approach to dialogical reconciliation is restorative and not retributive, especially given that the African communal life is grounded on interconnected relationships. Sarajevo in a way resonates with the African experience. It creates a bridge between the two experiences. So we are here in Sarajevo to gain inspiration, to say that dialogue builds bridges, and to believe in an alternative future where human dignity is respected and common good safeguarded. Thank you.
Good morning. Buenos días a todos. Bonjour à tous. I will speak in English. To build bridges for the future and to think about the theology of reconciliation today in Europe, but probably also in other parts of the world, we have to face the question of how we receive migrants and refugees. Sarajevo was the site of a deadly conflict, including a clash between cultures and religions that caused a massive displacement of populations. To prevent such tragedies from happening again, and to address the necessary integration of refugees, we must reflect on a theological ethics of hospitality that takes this question of cultural identities into account. In this regard, I would like to develop 3 ideas. That's the plan of my talk. First, a reflection on identity. Second, an invitation to think about hospitality within the context of the history of salvation. Third, an insistence on the need to learn from the poor and from refugees themselves. First, we must examine our conception of identity. Many people in contemporary Europe believe that welcoming migrants and refugees endangers our cultural identity, rooted both in Christian and humanistic traditions. Of course, the primary concern is with Islam, and this concern is heightened by the fear of terrorist attacks, which tends in our minds to equate refugees with potential terrorists and to equate Muslims with Islamists. The persistence of this belief highlights the challenge of trying to achieve the social, economic, and political integration of population of foreign origin within national communities. But this belief also points to an illusion that we must overcome, of course. The reappearance of national borders and even of walls is a paradoxical result of globalization and of the unification of the world. The defensive retreat into our own identities becomes even more pronounced as we face the risk of feeling lost in a world that has become more abstract and overwhelming. As the psychoanalyst Jean-Daniel Causse, who recently died, points out, quote, "The desire for borders is linked to the desire to restore or to preserve identities that we regard as the truth of our being. This desire responds to the fear of no longer being able to identify oneself personally and collectively. It seeks to avert the anguish of a self that faces uncertainty on the world stage." And Causse specifies that the border is, above all, a symbolic elaboration and an imaginary framework, and is therefore a linguistic fact. In other words, the border is linked with the organization of a body, whether it be individual or collective, with what permits the establishment of a differentiation between here and elsewhere, inside and outside, me and not me. In contrast, with the prevailing view that links identity with exclusion, Contemporary thinkers invite us to think about identity in relation with the concept of hospitality. While Jean-Paul Sartre invites us to think about identity, while Jean-Paul Sartre sees the others primarily as a threat to the centrality of my own person, and then as a means serving to my own development. Emmanuel Levinas, we spoke about him already, criticizes the entire vision of Western philosophy, which places the identity of the subject before all moral consideration. For Levinas, ethics comes first. Our responsibility for others precedes every other consideration. The other is therefore not to be considered a threat to my personal integrity, but rather as one who opens me to the possibility of moral experience, and thus to the truth of who am I. The other is both higher and lower than me. Higher because he or she is my master and teacher, compelling me to behave ethically, but also lower because he or she comes to me without the power of coercion, offering no resistance other than his or his moral claim. From this perspective, the prototype of the other is the widow, the orphan, the poor, and especially the stranger who stands at the door. For his part, Paul Ricoeur seeks to clarify and to correct this conception, which is potentially too asymmetrical, by presenting the mutual interaction between the self and the other by means of a narrative identity based on the telling of a story. For Ricoeur, otherness is constitutive of the self. We must consider oneself as another. The self cannot be thought about without the other or separated from the other. My autonomy is linked to my responsibility for others and to justice towards each person. I cannot be truly free if the other, indeed all others, are not equally free. The other is a part of myself interwoven into the history of my life. That being said, this is not simple. Accepting the challenge of the other presupposes a minimum of confidence in oneself. Children cannot accede to relationships and to language without the confidence that they place in their parents. Similarly, nations need a symbolic representation of their shared belonging to a common history and culture. But this identity should not be seen as a static reality, nor as a boundary that excludes others, but rather as the construction of a narrative that integrates the encounter with others. There is no France éternelle as such, frozen in an ideal and imaginary past. The reception of outsiders who have come to us, as well as our historical quarrels and exchanges with the English, the Spanish, and the Germans, and the other ones, are all part of our collective identity. Being closed in oneself is deadly both for individuals and for communities, for it takes us out of the human ethical identity of our humanity. Hospitality, the welcoming of the other in one's home, thus has the effect both of upsetting our primary identity, but also to reveal it by showing us the truth of our human condition. This is why hospitality must be the object of a process of learning and discernment. This brings me to my second point, about the learning of hospitality and the role of the Christian tradition. It's clear that the Christian tradition and the canon of Scripture invite us to consider hospitality extending to outsiders as an essential dimension of our Christian identity. The Bible does not directly tell us what we must do, but it does provide us with reference points and evokes some fundamental attitudes to guide us in our relationship with others, telling us that what is at stake is ultimately our relationship with God. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. Biblical narratives vividly demonstrate that migration are spiritual experiences and that God reveals himself in encounters with the stranger. Even as Israel constantly fears losing its identity through contact with the others and falling into idolatry, it is also unceasingly reminded of its duty to care for outsiders. For, quote, remember that you were an immigrant in Egypt, end of quote. The way in which Israel conceives its identity is crucial for understanding the status of outsider and how they are welcomed into the society. Is this identity closed in on itself, based on blood ties and exclusivist conception of its election, or is it instead a relational and vocational identity that understands its election as being at the service of all peoples? The Abraham cycle, his calling, his welcome of strangers by the oath of member, forcefully reveals us that God's love is not exclusive to Israel, but is for all nations. With Jesus and the New Testament, the universalist attitude is threatened by the project of announcing the good news to all nations. Jesus, this stranger who came into the world, as John says, stirs up a community of travelers and pilgrims who are themselves strangers to the city, yet very present to the world to bear witness to the disappearance of ethnic borders in the logic of the coming of the kingdom. The encounter between Peter and Cornelius in Acts is symbolic of the destruction of imaginary borders that treated pagans as impure. Even more so, these encounters tell us that God reveals himself in the very location of his hospitality. The Holy Spirit, quote, seized all who were in the house. Salvation is at stake. Yes. Salvation is at stake in the encounter with the other, with the foreigner. Salvation is at stake, as Pope Francis emphasizes. Welcoming the foreigner is welcoming the brother, welcoming Christ. But while Pope John Paul II strongly insisted on solidarity towards refugees and migrants in the name of an ethic of human rights, Pope Francis wants to take us to the heart of our faith and tell us that migration has a place in the history of salvation. Quote, the phenomenon of migration constitutes a sign of the times, a sign which speaks of the providential work of God in history and in the human community, with a view to universal communion, end of quote. For Christians, the status of the stranger is intimately bound to the question of salvation and to the witness that the Church must give as a people without borders, gathered by the Spirit, to announce the kingdom in the language of each person, contributing to the communion of all with respect for differences. And this brings me to my very last point, very short one, the necessity to meet and listen to the poor and to the migrants. The Pope invites us to contribute to a culture of encounter. Christians can thus refer humanity to its proper vocation, to its true identity, which is communion. But how do we do this? How do we do this? Charles Curran said that yesterday. The battle over the reception of migrants and refugees, for me, is partly a battle of the imagination. Our social and political relationships are mediated by our social imagination, by our shared attitudes and dreams. As Paul Ricoeur put it, quote, by changing his imagination, a person changes his existence, end of quote. The biblical imagination challenges our perspective by urging us to consider that for us, welcoming strangers could become an opportunity to host angels without our knowledge. We are invited to see the other as the neighbor whom we are called to serve. But even if the Bible helps us to prepare for it, nothing replaces the direct encounter with the suffering. As Pope Francis tells us, quote, "This crisis, which can be measured in numbers and statistics, we want instead to measure it with names, stories, and family," end of quote. Encounters with refugees and migrants are opportunities for conversion, as confirmed by many participants in the Jesuit Refugee Service Welcome Program, both those who are welcome and those who welcome them. We have much more to learn from the refugees, from the poor, who know better than others what it means to trust in God, and in what way the encounter between brothers and sisters can be beneficial. Over the past few years, several academic institutions in France, and probably in other parts in the world, have begun to develop theological research programs to explore how the experience of the poor and the migrants can be the source of a new understanding of the faith. It might be also a way for moral theologians to contribute to the battle of imaginations. Thank you.
Friends, our speakers have invited us to a conversion of imagination, or as Levinas might say, to imagine otherwise. We have half an hour now for questions. We'll proceed as we have. Please identify yourself and the member of our panel whom you would like to address. But before we do that, I'd ask you just one round of applause for these excellent presentations.
Odomaro.
My name is Odomaro Mubanjezi from Uganda, but based in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. My question is directed to Elias Omondi, but first of all, I thank him for his excellent presentation and contextualizing it in Rwanda and in the region, but also the role that the Institute directs, Institute of Peace and Security Studies does in training agents of dialogue and reconciliation. There is a bit of a dilemma I face. South Africa, Ubuntu, and Desmond Tutu making a serious contribution to reconciliation. But when you move up north around the equator and the Great Lakes region, I have found it very difficult to find an equivalent of that process. And I would wish that Elias shed some light. What are the barriers and challenges why the Catholic hierarchy within this region that is plagued by a lot of conflicts and violence, and yet with all this nice talk about Ubuntu and justice and reconciliation, justice and peace commissions throughout the churches, we haven't had a translation of that into an institutional framework for a structured dialogue and reconciliation. And related to that, why is there hesitancy to have truth-telling in this region? There seems to be a rush for justice, for some reconciliation, but we still have a deficit of truth in the region. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Odomaro. The South African experience was a great highlight in the continent, and I think all over the world. This was on television. But the post-conflict reconciliation processes normally are very difficult. We saw a few successful ones, difficult ones in Latin America before we even experienced the South African case. But I guess led by Mandela and Tutu, the whole idea of reconciling a difficult past of apartheid and even before that of colonization and the difficulty between the social and political structures that had been put there that were oppressive to the black population. I guess for me, the truth and reconciliation process was just the beginning. It set the stage for conversation. It set the stage for looking at ways in which the two communities can begin to live together, but also address the economic injustices that had been there for many years. So I wouldn't say it's a perfect process, but it was one that at least shed some light that it is possible to converse and dialogue about the past. And of course, truth is always a casualty of any experience of conflict and war. And in this case, truth-telling, as you've rightly pointed out, hasn't really emerged as we would wish it to be. Because you know that truth is also controlled by power and by the power play on the ground. In some cases, we've had the winner who has put into place the truth and reconciliation process. And in that way, it means that those particular structures of governance may not allow for the full truth to come out because some of these people are still in power. And that's where we make a distinction between, is it a presidential directive, like we saw in the case of Chile, or is it one that is constitutionally based for us to reach a certain level of truth-telling? But even with that, we have limitations, and we cannot fully achieve the full truth as long as we still have people in power to control that particular truth-telling space.
I also want to join the last speaker in just acknowledging and giving thanks to the panel for the very informative. The issue I want to raise is, you know, we talk about like war and conflicts and all that like out there, but there are certain wars and conflict that happen in the houses, that happen against African Americans consistently, wars that happen against women consistently. So I'm just worried that when we're talking about reconciliation and all those things, that we can focus on, you know, wars that are in your face, that, you know, the big national wars, whereas there are wars that are going on a daily basis affecting the most marginalized people. And that's where reconciliation also needs to be translated to.
Thank you to all of you for your great presentations. I have a question to Alain Thomasé. You talked about hospitality as a way to deal with migrants. I'm wondering what can be the exact place of hospitality within an ethics of migration? Because I'm a bit hesitating to use this category too strongly, because as long as there is a host and a guest, we expect the guest to depart sometime. And he's not, and we have to think about a way to recognize people coming as migrants, as refugees, potentially as co-citizens. And if they are co-citizens, they are no longer guests. How do we think this within a theological ethics of migration? And I think we should go beyond this paradigm of hospitality to be able to conceptualize this idea of living together in one world. So this is my question, not denying the worth of hospitality as kind of a virtue within migration ethics, but I think it might be not enough to build a migration ethics upon. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. Two things about that, sure. I think that hospitality is the first step, the necessary step. Foreigners will never be citizens if we are not welcoming them first. So it's a first step, and you know, hospitality leads to friendship. Hospitality is a reciprocal phenomenon. The host becomes the welcome at the end. You know, we are welcoming each other. So hospitality, which is asymmetrical at the beginning, becomes symmetrical at the end, and it leads normally to friendship. Because when we know people, we are becoming a friend of them, because you are the host of his world. He's not only the host of my world. You know what I mean? So it's a first step. So I think, of course, afterwards, it's not only hospitality, but rights and citizenship. I agree with you. But secondly, I think we need still hospitality when people are citizens too, because it's not so easy to welcome the differences in our countries, you know. People who are thinking differently, people who have different religions, people who have different ethical minds. So the virtue of hospitality is needed there too. You know, Jürgen Habermas, the famous philosopher, speaks about hospitality as a necessity for political dialogue. If you are not able to welcome the discourse of the other, you are not able to have a real discussion and democratic debate. So, well, I could develop that more, but because I wrote on hospitality much broader, but you're right, it's not enough, but nevertheless, we need it always. Thank you.
Before we proceed, Elias has one comment, please. Elias has one comment, please.
Just on Ontando saying that we need to think of the small wars, small conflicts beginning with the family and the others. We saw in Rwanda, for example, the Gacaca process that brought the whole issue of families into conversation that led to a process also of reconciliation, how we create spaces. Even yesterday, in that exercise we had, I don't know what you dreamt, but I dreamt that I woke up as a journalist. And then later on I became a cardinal. And, I called Sister Teresa Focades to my office, and the conversation was very good. Yes, sir. So I think, yeah, creating those communities of conversation, even in the most difficult of topics, as we've been engaging here and building those bridges, to me is very important. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Kus Marianto from Indonesia. My question goes to Father Elias Omondi. First question is there any African way to resolve conflicts with this, so that the other area can also learn from African way of thinking or way of life, is the first. And the second is, speaking about reconciliation, I think it is not always easy. Because the first step for me is not reconciliation. The first step is all about forgiveness. Because the reconciliation is the fruit of the forgiveness. And the forgiveness has to be the first. And speaking about forgiveness according to Christ is not easy, and it is completely opposite to the way of thinking of many people in the world. Because if we are talking forgiveness, sometimes it's not equally with the justice. God forgive without making justice, but what is sometimes that is forgiveness just is going something like this.
Thank you.
So just so that people know, there are about 17 hands up here. So just if you could appreciate one question when you're given the mic. Is there a reply to his?
Yes. Just briefly so that others may ask more questions. There's no African way, but there are African ways of forgiveness and reconciliation. As you know, Africa has 5,000 different languages and so many other communities, so the diversity is just so wide, more languages spoken in Africa than the rest of the world combined. So it's difficult to have one specific way, but there's common characteristics such as it is communal, And the idea is not only to heal two individuals, but also to think of the family and the clan, like we have in many other societies in other parts of the world. And also that justice is tied to compensation. There has to be some form of compensation, especially in situations of death or where an individual has been killed. And thirdly, that there is also a ritual that has to take place. And this has been very controversial with some of the Pentecostal churches that don't believe in those rituals. They see them as, you know, the out of the Christian traditional ways of doing things. But again, that's the tension that we live together.
So what we're going to do right now is I'm calling on 3 people here to formulate their questions, and then Linda will call on 2 people over there.
Thank you. Emmanuel Katongole from Uganda, teaching at University of Notre Dame in South Bend. Thank you all for your wonderful presentations. I want to direct a question to Alan, especially a question connected to the conversion of the imagination. How does that happen, the conversion of the imagination? Because it seems that for that to happen, you need already to be involved in hospitality. And yet at the same time, it seems that that is a condition for hospitality. So if you could elaborate on the conditions of possibility that allow this process of the conversion of the imagination. Thank you.
Kevin Ahern.
Great, thank you all. Kevin Ahern from Manhattan College in New York. Alain, just a question building on that. What is the specific vocation of the Catholic theologian in a church that is so marked by a lack of imagination, at least in the United States, and I think in many parts of Europe too? What can we do concretely with our students, but also with the wider ecclesial community? We have a tremendous amount of privilege and a tremendous amount of power in this room. Those of us, not many people are allowed to travel for a week to a different country or different continent. How can we use that privilege to form an imagination that goes beyond the academic journals and the conversations that we have here?
And finally, Maureen Juncker-Kenny.
So to Alain, so thanks a lot for introducing theory of subjectivity here, or theory of the human person. Together with Charles Curran, I would agree that acts have to be translated in the direction of persons against the objectivizing tendency of a lot of Catholic thinking. So going to Ricoeur and going to the theory of subjectivity, of the role of the other in the self, I think is absolutely needed. And if we ask what unites us here, is it natural law? Is it Catholic social teaching? Is it Vatican II? Is it the Bible? I think what has been missing is the lumen naturale, the light of reason, which Catholic ethicists can easily bring in. There's no obstacle for us to do so. So I'm really grateful that you've done that. And I think if we want to do what Susana Núñez wanted to do, the trabajo techo tierra, we need those social philosophers to be able to argue for it, to argue to the outside world why work, roof over one's head, and the earth, everybody has an equal right to the surface of the earth, says Kant. Yeah? So you have people who argue for this, and we need to bring them in. And I also think the philosophical principle of human dignity allows us even to criticize our use of the Bible, because if you say refugees, orphans, and widows in one breath, there's a problem, because widows is a social role. Widows could provide for themselves, as Herta Nagel-Doczekal makes clear. It's just the social role that doesn't allow them to do so. And in the Bible, therefore, they had to be looked after. They wouldn't need to be looked after if they were allowed to provide for themselves. Children can't, refugees have to get a helping hand. That's it.
Thank you. And Linda has 2 questions.
I am Sagai Raj Stanley from Chennai, India. a Jesuit. And thank you so much. This is to Father Thomas. Thank you, Alan, sorry. Thank you very much for your fine talk on refugees and migrants. This is not a question, but a question come loud thinking. Sometimes I think many of us, we don't go to the root cause. So my question was, why there are refugees and migrants today? Why there are? And many times there seems to be a confusion between economic migrants and forced asylum seekers. So there are also people who go. And Jesus fled to Egypt, certainly, yes. And today there are many more Herods in the world. And to sort of sideline thinking, why these people want to go to Germany or to Scandinavian countries and not they come to my country, India, or to Saudi Arabia. And the last thing, people have passports and passports are controlled, but money becomes a credit card.
Anthony from South Africa. I'm not sure whether this is directed at Alain or Amondi, but I would like your opinion on this. 21 years ago, driving from Johannesburg to Grahamstown, I was listening to the Truth and Reconciliation on the radio. It was being broadcast live. At one point, I had to stop the car because I was starting to shake. I was listening to a security policeman clinically and coolly describing how he waterboarded political activists. And what made me most distressed by it was not the gruesome detail, but the fact that he had no sense that he'd done anything wrong. Because in his own mind, his worldview was he was one of the saved. He was white, Protestant, male, member of the ruling class, the Herrenvolk, whatever you want to call it. And he simply could not imagine, I think, that he'd done anything wrong. How do we talk of reconciliation? How do we enter a conversation? How even do we exercise some kind of hospitality to that kind of person?
Would each of our speakers like to respond?
Yeah, I try to answer the conditions of hospitality and what could we do as ethicists to foster that. Maybe I would say that we all experience hospitality in our lives. So we have to be aware of that. We have been welcome in the world by other ones. So it's an exercise of memory first. We are the object of a welcome from others, from our mother, from our sisters and brothers, from our parents, from our friends, from etc., from the church who welcome us. So it's like, like the Europeans who forget that they were migrants themselves. We have not to forget that we were almost the object of hospitality from the others. So that's one of the first conditions, I would say. And the second would be, I think we have to develop, at the same time, narratives of joyful encounters, I would say, successful encounters with the foreigner. But we have to tell the stories about that and to diffuse these stories, Probably it's more powerful than concepts. You have to tell the story first. Then you bring the concept afterwards, but you have to form the imagination. And then I would say, do the experience. I spoke about the experience of the people of the Welcome Program in France, of the GRS, Jesuit Refugee Service. Most of the people were just generous at the first time. They would say, well, we just want to help some of these people who are on the street. And then they are converted by the encounter, really. They said, well, I had the imagination that that guy was cheating with us, and he realized that was not. And he listened to the story, the horrible story that they had to tell. So many people were converted like that in the direct encounters. So I would say direct encounter, remember our own stories, and to have good narratives about these encounters. So I would say that first to answer quickly, but I don't want to keep all the time. So.
Me parece muy importante concebir, digamos, el tema de la reconciliación y qué lugar ocupa el perdón en el marco de la reconciliación. Yo creo que por eso me parece fundamental el planteo que hicimos también de la justicia restaurativa, que en alguna medida concibe estas dos dimensiones y las lleva a un nivel de sociedad civil que no queda solo, digamos, únicamente en el marco de experiencias religiosas particulares, porque el mismo perdón es posible de vivir en un ámbito de sociedad civil, aun si tiene una raíz lógicamente profundamente cristiana, ¿verdad? Y creo que esto es importante, porque si no quedamos un poco atrapados en el discurso y también en nuestra forma de concebir, en un marco muy eclesial y muy, digamos, limitada a nuestra propia experiencia religiosa. Creo que justamente el poder concebir más toda la resolución de conflictos y la reconciliación, teniendo presente los parámetros bíblicos y demás, pero también desde un abordaje como puede ser la justicia restaurativa como una forma de concebir también el cuerpo de Cristo, ¿no? Creo que nos lleva a una visión más amplia y más factible de poder concebir, digamos, una reconciliación de pueblos y demás. Creo que una experiencia interesante, que no es ahora el caso de desarrollar, es la colombiana, la que está transitando Colombia. No es sencilla, no es fácil, no está determinada, no está dicho que llega a buen puerto, pero hace y surca camino. Y surca un camino interesante porque en los diálogos de La Habana pudo poner víctima y victimario juntos. Y ese es un paso enorme en la concepción de construcción, digamos, de la sociedad en la reconciliación.
Anthony, thank you. I don't know whether I understood your question well, but I think Susanna has also very well touched on it. That is reconciliation or forgiveness and reconciliation is a gradual process. We may not have everyone on board, but at least the process has begun. And the intervention about also gaining the wisdom from some of the philosophers that we've heard, I will also say to add on to the social wisdom, to the cultural wisdom of our own societies, and to link those up as a resource for that whole process of reconciliation. Thank you.
Maybe I could add just a word about the power we have as ethicists. I think we could contribute to create this hopeful narrative for Europe and for the other continent. You know, and that's a problem we have now in politics. We have no more political views who opens the future in a hopeful way, I would say, and so we could contribute for that. Yeah, I think so, based probably on our tradition and the Bible and the experience we had with the encounter with the people too.
Lillian Dubé.
Right, I grew up in colonial Rhodesia, so
just put it by your mouth.
Okay, right. I grew up in colonial Rhodesia, which was characterized by brutal racial segregation. And when I was a teenager, we got our independence, and the message that we were fed on was forgiveness, forgiveness, and forgiveness. And I got it. So I do appreciate forgiveness. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of South Africa unfolded during my formative years as a theologian, as a young time, to discuss its benefits and its shortcomings. I also appreciate that. But without reparations, I don't know how you move beyond just forgiveness and truth-telling. There should be room for reparations if we are going to talk about justice of any type.
Gonzalo.
I'm Gonzalo Villagran from Granada Faculty of Theology. It's a question for Elias. How does, when we put reconciliation at the center and at the focus, how does that nuances the idea of prophecy? How should we understand prophecy now that reconciliation is so at the center? Thank you.
Lisa Fulham from the Jesuit School in Berkeley. There we go. Lisa Fulham from the Jesuit School in Berkeley. I am grateful for the rich account of the intersection of forgiveness and reconciliation as a process. But I want to ask the antecedent question of, are there situations under which forgiveness itself is immoral? Are there conditions under which one should not forgive? I am thinking, for example, of women in abusive relationships in these small wars who are advised to forgive, often to their death. So are there conditions for forgiveness, and should there be? Thank you.
Could we invite our speakers to respond? Folks, we have 5 minutes remaining, so...
I wish I had all the answers, but the reparation, yes. I did say that for in a number of African societies, the whole issue of compensation was very important, and compensation was not the burden of the individual, but rather the family and the clan and the community as a symbol of reparation. I do agree for the case of South Africa, and even in the US, in Australia, in Canada, some of the historical injustices, this whole issue has come back. But again, we need to know that there's only so much that reparation can do or compensation can do to repair the wounds of the past. And in some cases, we are dealing with generations that are not even present. And to what extent is it morally or ethically acceptable that the following generation should claim that particular reparation? But in any case, I think what is much more important is creating that space for dialogue and conversation on how that healing can take place, with whichever form that takes into account. For the case of South Africa, just Lillian, to follow up on your question, is that I think looking at economic emancipation is even much more important. There have been discussions of black empowerment, but I don't think it has taken the roots it's supposed to take to the extent to which there is empowerment in education, but also economic empowerment. Reconciliation and prophecy, for sure, there are situations where forgiveness or reconciliation comes as a grace. And I think we need also to see that as a perspective, as people of faith, that it comes as a given without any claim to justice or any claim to compensation. But I think we need to move much more into prophesying for a different future for the entire community. And it's true that forgiveness too can be manipulative. And there are situations where we can morally ask the question, why? But I was signaling to Suzanne to answer that particular question.
Thank you.
Just a word about in restorative. Sorry.
El perdón está en la raíz de toda posible sanación personal y comunitaria. Por lo tanto, los caminos de perdón pueden ser múltiples. Los caminos y los tiempos, yo diría, de perdón son infinitos. Pero el perdón en sí es una necesidad básica de la sanidad de la persona y de las comunidades, cualquiera sean las situaciones. Yo lo he experimentado en carne propia con un exilio de años, con familia torturada, con un hermano preso 10 años, cuando las dictaduras del Cono Sur. Por lo tanto, lo puedo decir en carne propia. Pero sin perdón es muy difícil poder reconstruir un mapa de uno mismo y de la identidad de uno mismo y de la identidad de los otros. Y con el perdón, en cambio, es una autopista en alguna medida a la posibilidad de construcción de relaciones en todos los planos. Sin duda, los tiempos, como le dijeron al Papa en Colombia a una mujer, yo no logro perdonar, pero le pido a Dios que perdone por mí. Y el Papa dijo, ese es el lugar desde donde, teológico, digamos, del perdón. O sea, tantas veces nosotros, en nuestra impotencia, no logramos perdonar, pero sí es posible perdonar, digamos, Dios nos hace capaces de perdonar y las circunstancias, los tiempos no son importantes, en definitiva. Es importante la voluntad y la conciencia.
Alain, we give you the final word.
Just a word about, I think it's one of the practice of the restorative justice to put together the criminal and some victims of the same crime, you know. So I think it helps to these criminals to be aware of what they have done. Because the problem of these people who doesn't realize, I speak about this experience you said in South Africa, that they don't imagine precisely what would be the bad things they have done. So, you know, if the rule, the golden rule must function because you are able to transfer yourself in the world of the other. If not, you cannot use the rule, do the other what you would like to be done for you. So this transfer is necessary in the encounter, is one of the ways of the justice, restorative justice, to precisely be aware by transfer of imagination of the condition of the victim, precisely. It's one of the ways of conversion, I think. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our three plenary speakers and to all of the helpful questions from the audience, bringing out difficult, subtle dimensions of justice and reconciliation on micro levels and geopolitical levels, so to speak. Quick announcement about our next steps in the day. From here, you'll go directly to part 2 of your continental discussion groups. As you can see, coffee is already available in the rooms. For those of you in the Asian regional group who split up yesterday, please go directly to your rooms from yesterday, and coffee will be in each of those 2 subgroups, okay? After the Continental Discussion Group, the North Americans are meeting in the gym. There will be no further meetings in the gym, so you're free, of course, to visit the posters there, but if you wish to take your physical poster home with you, please take it down by the end of the banquet tonight. If you don't want to deal with it, I'll deal with it for you after that. And finally, because we go right from the continental discussion groups into the second set of concurrent papers, please do take a look at the bulletin boards that are now outside the lobby where you registered, should you be interested in joining one of these topical lunch discussion groups, okay? All are welcome. Enjoy your discussions.